History isn't just about cruelty, it's also about being incredibly, creatively stupid. We're skipping the guillotine and the rack to explore the truly bizarre side of justice. This is a world where bad musicians were forced to wear iron flutes of shame, and farm animals were put on trial with their own lawyers. This isn't a story of pain, it's a showcase of humanity's most gloriously illogical moments. 1. Let's say you've had a truly epic night in medieval England, a night that ended with you declaring your love to a horse and trying to pay for your drinks with a button. The next morning, instead of a simple fine, you might be sentenced to wear the drunkard's cloak. This wasn't a stylish garment, but a claustrophobic, splintery wooden barrel, custom-fitted for public humiliation. Your head would pop out the top, and your arms would stick out the sides, rendering you completely useless. You'd be forced to parade through town, a walking advertisement for the perils of cheap ale. Imagine the sheer awkwardness, the weight, the smell of stale beer and regret, and the inability to do anything but waddle. It was the ultimate walk of shame, a dumb but visually spectacular punishment designed to make you the headline act in the village's daily comedy festival. 2. Back in 17th century Germany, being a bad musician wasn't just a matter of taste. It could be a literal crime. If your musical stylings were considered an assault on the public's eardrums, you could be sentenced to wear the Schandflöte or shame flute. This device was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive engineering, a heavy, ornate iron flute that was locked around your neck with your fingers clamped into a playing position. You couldn't make a sound. Its sole purpose was to silently scream, "I am terrible at this." You'd be marched through the streets, a walking statue dedicated to musical failure. It was the historical equivalent of being forced to wear a sign that says, "My band is awful," a brutally efficient and dumbly elegant way to enforce quality control on the arts. 3. In ancient Babylon, they didn't mess around when it came to beer. According to the legendary Code of Hammurabi, if you were a brewer or tavern owner who served subpar suds, the punishment was as ironic as it was final. You would be sentenced to be drowned in your own terrible, watered-down beer. Think about the sheer poetic stupidity of that. There was no appeal, just a very personal and very wet form of justice. It's perhaps the most extreme example of a company being held accountable for its product in all of history. This wasn't just a bad review, it was a fatal one. It sent a clear message to all other brewers. Maintain your standards, or your worst batch will literally be the death of you. 4. We've all dreamed of a creative way to deal with a noisy neighbor, but medieval France took it to a bizarrely theatrical level. If you were the town's designated loudmouth, the punishment wasn't to silence you, but to make you the star of your own noise parade. You would be forced to march through the streets, banging on a pot or a pan, to demonstrate to everyone the kind of cacophony you were responsible for. The logic here is so beautifully backward, it's a work of art. The solution to a noise problem is an officially sanctioned, even louder noise problem. It was public shaming through forced performance, a dumb but memorable way of making sure the entire community knew exactly who was to blame for their collective headache. 5. In medieval Germany, where community harmony was paramount, gossip was treated as a serious social crime. If you and your accomplice were caught spreading rumors, you could be locked into the gossip's violin. This wasn't a musical instrument, but a hinged wooden board with holes for 2 heads and 4 hands, forcing you to stand face-to-face with your partner in crime for hours. It was a punishment of pure, unadulterated awkwardness. Trapped in an intimate, silent standoff, you had nothing to do but stare into the eyes of the person who got you into this mess, all while the entire town watched. It was psychological warfare disguised as a dumb wooden contraption, designed to make you regret every whispered secret you ever shared. 6. In England and its American colonies, a woman labeled a scold, a wonderfully vague term for any woman who dared to argue or speak her mind, could be sentenced to the ducking stool. This was a chair fastened to the end of a long wooden beam, which was then used to repeatedly submerge her in the local river or pond. The official, laughably stupid justification was that the cold water would cool her hot temper. In reality, it was a brutal and terrifying form of public torture, a life-threatening ordeal presented as a legitimate legal remedy. It's a chilling example of how a society can invent a dumb, pseudo-scientific reason to justify the cruel and public punishment of women for simply not being quiet. 7. If you committed a minor crime in the Middle Ages, your punishment might be less about physical pain and more about a complete and total annihilation of your dignity. You could be sentenced to wear the cap and bells, the full garish uniform of a court jester. Forced to don the brightly colored tunic and the silly hat with its incessantly jingling bells, you became a walking, talking symbol of foolishness. Every step you took was announced by a cheerful jingle, drawing eyes and mockery from all directions. It was a punishment that relied on social pressure, but it had a fatal flaw. If the person had no shame to begin with, they'd just turn it into the best day of their life, effectively ruining the punishment for everyone. 8. The Roman army was the epitome of disciplined masculinity, built on an ideal of courage called virtus. So, when a soldier showed cowardice, the punishment had to be as psychologically crushing as possible. One of the most ingeniously dumb penalties was forcing the soldier to wear a tunica mullibris, a woman's tunic, and stand in the center of the camp all day. In this hyper-masculine world, this was more devastating than a whipping. It was a public declaration that he had failed so completely as a warrior that he was no longer considered a man in the eyes of his comrades. It was a bizarrely theatrical and deeply humiliating ritual, a form of psychological warfare designed to weaponize gender roles to enforce battlefield discipline. 9. In Denmark, they apparently looked at the drunkard's cloak and thought, "That's too gentle. We can do better or worse." Their solution for public drunkenness was a truly baffling piece of logic known as the drunkard's cup. This wasn't just any cup. It was an enormous, ridiculously oversized goblet that the offender had to fill with ale and chug in one go. The theory, if you can call it that, was a sort of extreme hair-of-the-dog treatment. It was a kill or cure approach where the cure was a potentially lethal dose of the poison itself. It's a punishment that feels like it was invented by other drunks. A bizarre ritual that could either give you the hangover to end all hangovers or just end you altogether. It's a perfect example of trying to solve a problem by aggressively making it much, much worse. 10. Ancient Athens, the cradle of democracy and philosophy, decided that brutal physical punishments were a bit unsophisticated. So, for minor offenses, they devised a form of torture that was uniquely intellectual and soul-crushing. They forced people to watch bad plays. This wasn't just a boring evening out, it was a state-sanctioned assault on your senses and intellect. Imagine being strapped to a stone seat, forced to endure hours of terrible acting, clunky dialogue, and a plot so nonsensical it made your brain ache. For a culture that revered theater as a high art form, being subjected to the worst of it was a profound form of torment. It's perhaps the most passive-aggressive punishment in history, proving that you don't need whips and chains when you have truly awful government-funded performance art. 11. The Romans, much like the Greeks, had a deep appreciation for the arts, but they also had little patience for those who were bad at them. If you were a poet in ancient Rome whose verses were just plain terrible, you wouldn't be exiled or fined. Instead, you would be subjected to a special kind of psychological hell, being forced to repeatedly rewrite your own awful poems until they were deemed acceptable. This is a level of creative torment that is both genius and incredibly cruel. It's not just criticism. It's being forced to confront the abyss of your own mediocrity over and over again. Imagine being locked in a room with your worst work, an editor from hell breathing down your neck, knowing you can't leave until you somehow turn your literary garbage into gold. It's a punishment designed to break a person's spirit, one terrible stanza at a time. 12. The legal system of medieval Europe occasionally went completely off the rails and into a realm of pure, unadulterated absurdity with the practice of animal trials. Yes, you heard that right. Animals, pigs, rats, weevils, even swarms of locusts could be formally charged with crimes, brought to court, and put on trial. A pig that injured a child might be arrested and assigned a court-appointed lawyer who would genuinely argue its case. Records show lawyers defending their animal clients by arguing they were provoked or acting in self-defense. The proceedings were deadly serious, with judges, witnesses, and solemn verdicts. Often, the animal was found guilty and sentenced to execution, just like a human. It represents a peak of humanity trying to apply its complex rules to a world that simply doesn't care, resulting in the dumbest legal theater ever staged. 13. The Romans had a flair for the dramatic, and nowhere is this more evident than in their punishment for killing a close relative, known as pona culi, or punishment of the sack. This wasn't a simple execution. The condemned person was first beaten, then sewn into a thick leather sack. But they weren't alone in there. For reasons that are lost to sane logic, they were joined by a bizarre cocktail of live animals: a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey. The whole writhing, panicking bag of chaos was then thrown into a river or the sea. It's a punishment so overly complicated and strangely specific that it feels like it was designed by a committee on a very bad acid trip. Why those 4 animals? We can only guess, but it remains the most ridiculously over-the-top and creatively dumb execution method ever devised. 14. The Aztec Empire ran a tight ship, and their laws on public drunkenness were a masterclass in drastic escalation. If you were caught intoxicated for the first time, the punishment was public humiliation. Your head was shaved completely bald, marking you as a deviant for all to see. It was a severe warning, a social stain. But if you were caught a second time, there was no fine, no community service, no second shaved head. The punishment was simply death. That's it. From a bad haircut to capital punishment in one easy step. There was no middle ground, no 3 strikes rule. The Aztec legal system gave you exactly 1 chance to learn your lesson. It's a terrifyingly dumb, slippery slope with no slope at all, just a single step and then a cliff. 15. The Prussians were known for their rigid discipline and brutal efficiency, and their approach to public drunkenness was no exception. Instead of just locking someone up, they devised a punishment that was disgusting, humiliating, and grimly practical: the drunkard's search. The offender was handed a toothbrush, yes, a toothbrush, and tasked with cleaning the public latrines. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. They were expected to scrub the filthiest places in the city with the most comically inadequate tool imaginable. It was a multi-sensory assault designed to forge a powerful, unforgettable link between the joy of drinking and the horror of human waste. It's a punishment that is both profoundly dumb in its cruelty and terrifyingly smart in its effectiveness as a deterrent. 16. In Scotland and England, if a woman was considered a scold or a gossip, the authorities had a truly monstrous device to silence her: the scold's bridle. This was a horrifying iron mask, a cage that was locked onto the woman's head. It was bad enough on its own, but the most diabolical feature was the bridle bit, a small plate, often covered in sharp spikes, that was forced into her mouth and pressed down on her tongue. Any attempt to speak would result in agonizing pain and severe injury. It was a tool of public humiliation and torture, designed not just to silence a person, but to mutilate them for the crime of speaking. It stands as one of history's dumbest and most barbaric overreactions to what was, at worst, an annoyance. 17. Colonial America, a land of freedom and new beginnings, also had a uniquely messy and bizarre form of mob justice known as tarring and feathering. This wasn't an official punishment, but it was a popular one. If you angered the local community, a mob might grab you, strip you down, and cover your body in hot, sticky pine tar. Then, for the grand finale, they would dump sackfuls of feathers all over you until you resembled a grotesque, human-sized chicken. The goal was intense public humiliation and pain, as the hot tar would often cause severe burns, and removing it was an agonizing process that ripped off skin. It's a punishment that hovers in a weird space between brutal assault and a surreal, nightmarish art project, turning a person into a walking, sticky monument to mob stupidity. 18. The Victorian era was obsessed with morality and hard work, and this obsession led to the invention of one of the most pointless and soul-crushing punishments ever conceived: the treadmill. But this wasn't the gym equipment we know today. It was a massive, cylindrical wheel with steps, which prisoners were forced to climb for up to 10 hours a day. The truly dumb part? Often, the treadmill did absolutely nothing. It was a machine for grinding the wind. Its sole purpose was to exhaust and demoralize prisoners through grueling, monotonous, and utterly meaningless labor. It was punishment by futility, a system designed to break a man's spirit by forcing him to spend his entire day walking nowhere and achieving nothing. It was the physical embodiment of a pointless, bureaucratic nightmare. 19. If the treadmill was too collaborative for the Victorian prison system's liking, they had a more personal option for destroying a prisoner's will: the crank. This was a simple handle in a prisoner's solitary cell, connected to a mechanism inside a box. The prisoner was given a daily quota, often 10,000 turns or more, which they had to complete. The crank was rigged with resistance to make it incredibly difficult to turn. And the punchline to this cruel joke? The crank was connected to nothing. It didn't pump water. It didn't grind grain. It didn't power anything. Its one and only function was to be turned. It was a machine designed to enforce pure, unadulterated, useless work, a perfect metaphor for a system that saw punishment not as rehabilitation, but as the systematic destruction of the human soul through mind-numbing pointlessness. 20. In Imperial China, a common form of public punishment was the cangue. This was a heavy wooden board locked around an offender's neck, essentially a portable pillory. While it was undoubtedly uncomfortable, its true cruelty lay in its clever, dumb design. The cangue was made just wide enough that the wearer couldn't reach their own mouth with their hands. This meant they couldn't eat or drink without assistance. They were forced to rely entirely on the mercy of passers-by or the kindness of family members to survive. It was a punishment that outsourced its own cruelty to the public, turning a person's basic survival into a constant, humiliating performance of dependency. It wasn't just a physical burden. It was a brilliantly simple machine for social isolation and slow, public degradation. 21. The Middle Ages had a unique approach to determining guilt or innocence called trial by ordeal, which was basically outsourcing the justice system to God and hoping for the best. One of the most popular versions was the ordeal of boiling water. The accused would have to plunge their arm into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a stone or a ring from the bottom. Afterward, their arm would be bandaged and sealed. If, after 3 days, the wound was healing cleanly, they were declared innocent, as God had clearly protected them. If it was infected and festering, they were guilty. It's a perfect no-lose situation for the prosecution, a system of justice based on the dumb assumption that divine intervention works on a predictable schedule and that boiling water sometimes just decides not to burn people. 22. In the Ottoman Empire during certain periods, coffee was seen as a dangerous and mind-altering substance that promoted laziness and seditious thoughts. The official response to this caffeine crisis was, naturally, completely proportional and sane. If you were caught drinking coffee, the punishment could be a severe beating. But for repeat offenders, some sultans, like Murad IV, reportedly escalated things dramatically. The punishment could be having you sewn into a leather bag and unceremoniously thrown into the Bosphorus Strait. This is a level of overreaction that is truly breathtaking, from enjoying a cup of joe to being fish food in a single step. It's a dumbly terrifying reminder that history's biggest moral panics often start with something incredibly trivial. 23. In some parts of early America, they decided that the traditional whipping post was a bit too static and boring. So they invented a more athletic and chaotic version of the punishment, the whipping post race. Instead of just tying the condemned person to a post, they would be given a small head start and forced to run towards a designated finish line, like a county border or a town sign. The entire crowd, led by the sheriff or a designated whipper, would then chase after them, trying to land as many lashes as possible before they reached safety. It was a bizarre and brutal spectacle that turned corporal punishment into a twisted spectator sport, a horrifying combination of a public flogging and a fun run. It's a dumbly chaotic system where the severity of your punishment depended entirely on how fast you could run. 24. The Puritans of colonial America were masters of public shaming, and they came up with a way to turn your sins into a mandatory fashion statement. Instead of just fines or stocks, offenders were often forced to wear their crime stitched onto their clothing. The most famous example is the Scarlet A for adultery, but there were others. D for drunkenness, T for theft. You became a walking billboard for your own moral failings, forced to carry the label of your worst moment with you wherever you went. It was a deeply personal and psychologically relentless form of punishment, designed to make you an outcast in your own community. It's a dumbly literal interpretation of wearing your heart on your sleeve, except instead of your heart, it's your criminal record. 25. The ancient Egyptians, a civilization known for its monumental architecture and complex theology, also had some interesting ideas about petty crime. Instead of fines or labor, one recorded punishment for minor offenses was forced gluttony. The guilty party would be taken to a public place and compelled to eat vast quantities of food and drink, usually rich and oily things, far beyond the point of comfort. The goal was to force them to vomit violently and uncontrollably in front of a crowd. It was a punishment that weaponized the body's own natural reflexes. The humiliation wasn't just in the crime, but in the disgusting, involuntary spectacle of purging yourself in public. It's a dumbly visceral form of justice, designed to be so unpleasant and embarrassing that you'd think twice before stealing a loaf of bread again. 26. In Imperial China, maintaining dignity was everything, especially for the educated class of government officials. So, the legal system devised a punishment that was specifically engineered to be as humiliating as possible: the Ting, or public flogging of the buttocks. An official who had fallen out of favor with the emperor would be brought to the imperial court, stripped of his lower garments in front of his peers, and beaten with long bamboo staves. This wasn't just a painful beating. It was a ritual of degradation designed to destroy a man's reputation and face. While it sounds almost comical, it was deadly serious. The beatings were often so severe they resulted in lifelong injury or death. It was a dumbly brutal system that combined physical agony with the complete destruction of a person's social standing. 27. Across various cultures and time periods, a particularly vile and unimaginative form of punishment has repeatedly appeared: forcing someone to drink urine. This act carries no real physical danger in most cases, but its power lies in its profound ability to humiliate and disgust. It served no logical purpose in terms of justice or deterrence. It didn't correct a behavior or repay a debt to society. Its one and only goal was to be the most degrading, foul experience the punishers could think of. It's a testament to a certain lack of creativity and cruelty. A dumb, go-to move for asserting dominance when you can't be bothered to invent something more elaborate. It represents a baseline of human nastiness, a punishment that says less about the crime and more about the punisher's complete failure of imagination. 28. We've already mentioned the cap and bells as a punishment, but its sheer dumb brilliance is worth another look. In medieval society, where your reputation was everything, this punishment was a form of social death. By forcing a person to wear the ridiculous costume of a jester, the authorities were making a powerful statement. This person is so inconsequential that their very existence is now a joke. Every jingling step was a reminder of their transgression, turning them into a mobile source of public amusement. It was a system that cleverly outsourced the act of punishment to the entire community. The court didn't have to do anything more. The laughter and scorn of neighbors did all the heavy lifting. It was a dumb but incredibly efficient engine of shame, powered by little more than a silly hat and a few bells. 29. Ancient Sparta was a society obsessed with discipline, brevity, and military perfection. They had no time for idle chatter or pointless questions, especially from the youth. To train young Spartans to be concise and speak only when necessary, the older warriors had a simple and direct method of correction. If a young man spoke out of turn or said something foolish, an elder could simply walk up to him and bite him, hard, on the thumb. It's a punishment so primal and strange it sounds like something you'd see in a wolf pack. There was no lecture, no formal discipline, just a sharp, painful reminder to keep your mouth shut, unless you had something important to say. It's a dumbly effective form of behavioral conditioning that is both utterly ridiculous and, you have to admit, probably worked pretty well. 30. In ancient Rome, the Vestal virgins were priestesses who tended the sacred flame of Vesta, and they were required to take a 30-year vow of celibacy. Breaking this vow was considered a catastrophic offense that endangered the entire state. However, there was a problem. It was forbidden to spill the blood of a Vestal. So, the Romans, in a stunning display of legalistic gymnastics, came up with a solution. If a Vestal was found guilty, she would be buried alive. They would build a small underground chamber with a tiny amount of food and water, let her into it, and then seal her in to die. By their dumb logic, they hadn't spilled her blood. She would just stop breathing. It was a horrifying slow-motion execution that allowed them to kill her while technically following the letter of the law. 31. The bureaucracy of Imperial China was a well-oiled machine of immense complexity, and the emperor was seen as a divine figure. This combination led to an absurdly high-stakes environment for the scholars who prepared official documents. A single mistake, a tiny typo, or a misplaced character in a document intended for the emperor could be interpreted as a sign of disrespect or even treason. The punishment for such a clerical error was not a stern talking to. The offending scholar could be executed on the spot, or if they were lucky, exiled to a remote, desolate corner of the empire for the rest of their life. This is perhaps the most extreme reaction to a typo in human history, a system where the delete key hadn't been invented and the cost of a spelling mistake was your own head. 32. The ancient Egyptians' reverence for cats is legendary, but the legal consequences of this feline worship were truly insane. According to the historian Herodotus, killing a cat in Egypt, even by accident, was a capital crime. The penalty was death, often carried out by an angry mob on the spot, with no trial necessary. Their devotion didn't stop there. If a family's pet cat died of natural causes, the entire household was required to go into a deep state of mourning, and as an outward sign of their grief, they had to shave off their eyebrows. It's a set of rules so bizarre it's hard to believe. A society where a house cat had more legal protection than most humans, and where your eyebrows were held hostage by the mortality of your pet. 33. Marriage has always been a cornerstone of society, often more about contracts and alliances than love. But some cultures took the idea of fulfilling a contract to a morbid and profoundly weird extreme with the practice of necrogamy, or marriage to a corpse. If a man died after he was formally betrothed but before the wedding ceremony, the bride could be forced to marry his dead body. The ceremony would proceed as planned, with the deceased groom propped up to stand at the altar. This wasn't about love. It was about honoring the agreement between families, securing inheritance rights, or sometimes ensuring the deceased had a spouse in the afterlife. It's a practice so incredibly dumb and unsettling that it defies all modern logic, turning what should be a celebration of life into a bizarre, legally binding ritual with a non-consenting and very, very quiet participant. So our tour of legislative insanity ends. From killer typos to fashion-based justice, history has proven that its capacity for absurdity is limitless. But we know this is just the tip of the iceberg. Now, we challenge you. What is the one jaw-droppingly dumb, bizarre, or nonsensical punishment from history that we completely failed to mention? The comment section is now open as a museum for all the historical idiocy we missed. Prove that our list isn't complete. If this journey through absurdity made you feel slightly better about the modern world, pay your respects with a like and subscribe for more dives into historical madness.